Welcome back, everyone. We got a really fascinating master's thesis sent to us, and I'm excited to dive into it with you.
Yeah, it looks pretty cool.
It's all about something called Memristor Neural Networks.
Mm.
And honestly, even I had to do a bit of research just to wrap my head around what memristors even are.
Well, luckily, that's why I'm here.
Exactly. So let's start with that. In the simplest terms possible, what is a memristor?
Okay, so you can think about it like this. A memristor is kind of like a resistor, but it has memory.
Okay, so it remembers.
Yeah, it remembers the history of the voltage or current that's been applied to it. So unlike a normal resistor, its resistance isn't fixed. It changes based on what it's experienced electrically.
Wow. I'm already seeing how that could be incredibly useful for mimicking the way our brains work.
Exactly. That's why there's so much excitement around memristors. They could be the key to making neural networks much more efficient, adaptable, even closer to how our own brains learn.
So it's not just about the present state, but about the whole history of the electrical signals. That's a big deal for building AI systems that are more like us, right?
Right, and unlike the components we typically use in circuits like your resistors, capacitors, and inductors, memristors don't respond to electrical signals in a simple linear way. They have this fascinating nonlinearity, this memory aspect, which opens up a whole new set of possibilities.
So how does this memory actually work? How does a memristor switch between different resistance states?
Good question. There are actually two main ways this switching happens: unipolar and bipolar. Unipolar switching means that the memristor changes state based only on the magnitude of the voltage applied to it. But bipolar switching, on the other hand, means that the polarity of the voltage matters. You need to alternate between positive and negative voltages to toggle between the high and low resistance states.
I see. So the type of switching depends on how the memristor is designed and what materials it's made of.
Precisely. And that's where things get really interesting because modeling this kind of behavior mathematically can get quite complex.
Absolutely. So how do researchers capture all the nuances of memristor behavior in their simulations?
They use a bunch of different mathematical models, each with its own pros and cons. Some models, like the STBM, are pretty simple, relying on just a handful of key parameters. Others, like the team or V-team models, are way more complex. They take into account things like threshold voltages and how temperature affects the memristor.
It sounds like there's a trade-off between keeping the model simple and making it accurate.
For sure. You always have to choose the right tool for the job. A simpler model might be fine if you just need a general understanding, but if you want really precise predictions, especially for specific applications, you'll need a more complex model.
Now, the thesis we're looking at today focuses on using memristors in a specific type of neural network called fully connected networks. What exactly does that mean?
It means that every single neuron in one layer of the network is connected to every single neuron in the next layer. That creates a super interconnected structure, a lot like the networks we see in our own brains. This type of connection allows for really complex pattern recognition.
So we've talked about what memristors are, the different ways they can switch states, and the mathematical models used to describe them. The thesis takes all of this and tries to figure out how to use these components to build powerful, brain-inspired neural networks.
That's right. And they didn't just stick to simulations, they actually went ahead and fabricated real memristor devices.
Wow, they actually built them.
Yeah. It's a process called microfabrication.
Yeah.
Basically, they deposit and etch these incredibly thin layers of material on a silicon wafer. That's how they created the actual memristor structures.
It sounds like a super delicate process, working at such tiny scales. But the key takeaway for me is that they were able to build these physical memristor components. That's pushing the limits of what we can do in nanofabrication. But of course, building the device is just the first step. How did they test and characterize these tiny components?
Well, they used a mix of software tools. There's some existing software out there like LabVIEW, but get this, they also developed their own custom tool called PyCharmM, which stands for Python Characterization of Memristors.
Very cool. So they weren't just reliant on off-the-shelf tools, they built some of their own. What did this custom tool allow them to do?
With PyCharmM, they could very accurately measure the electrical properties of the fabricated memristors and observe how their resistance changed under different conditions.
That's impressive. They build the devices, indeed the tools, to study them in detail. So what was the next challenge they tackled?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles in working with memristers is finding the right parameters for those mathematical models we talked about earlier. It's like trying to fine-tune a really complex machine with a ton of different knobs and dials.
I can imagine that would be incredibly tedious and time-consuming.
Oh.
And you can't just randomly tweak things, right? It needs to be systematic. So how did they approach this parameter optimization problem?
They actually took inspiration from nature. They used something called genetic algorithms, or GAs.
Interesting. I've heard of those before in other contexts. How did they apply them to memristers?
GAs essentially mimic the process of natural selection to evolve the best performing parameter sets.
So it's survival of the fittest, but for parameters.
Exactly. You start with a whole population of potential solutions, each one representing a different set of parameters for the memristor model. Then you test how well each solution performs. Basically, you're seeing how accurately it predicts the behavior of the actual physical memristors they fabricated.
So they're comparing the simulation results to the real-world data.
Yeah.
And then what?
The solutions, or parameter sets that perform the best, get to reproduce. They are used to create a new generation of solutions. And this whole process keeps repeating generation after generation.
So it's like an evolutionary process where the best parameter sets survive and get passed on.
Exactly. And as this process goes on, the model becomes more and more accurate at predicting the behavior of the actual physical memristors.
So they started with physical memristor devices, created detailed mathematical models to describe them, and then used this clever genetic algorithm approach to find the best parameters for those models. What did they do next with these optimized models?
Well, now they had models that were really well grounded in data from their real devices. So they used these models to actually simulate the behavior of memristor-based neural networks. Specifically, the thesis looked at two main types of networks.
Okay, let's hear about those two types. What were they?
The first type is a single output layer network.
Single output, so just one answer for each input.
Yeah, you can think of it like asking the network a yes or no question or trying to get a single numerical prediction. It's good for simpler tasks.
And the second type.
The second type is a multi-output layer network. In this type, you can have multiple outputs for a given input, so it's more nuanced, more complex.
So with multiple outputs, you could do things like classify an image into multiple categories.
Exactly. Or you could use it to forecast a sequence of values instead of just a single prediction.
I'm seeing how that could be really useful in a wider range of applications. But were these simulations purely theoretical, or did they use any real-world data to see how these networks would perform in practice?
Well, for the multi-output example, they actually used a dataset called the water quality dataset.
Water quality. How does that tie in with Memristor neural networks?
This dataset looks at the relationship between different characteristics of water and the types of organisms that are found in Slovenian rivers.
That's interesting. So a very real-world application. How did they actually run these simulations? What tools did they use?
Okay, so they combine two powerful tools, LT-SPICE, which is a circuit simulator, and Python, a programming language. Think of LT-SPICE as a virtual lab where they can build and test their memristor circuits without having to physically create them.
So LT-SPICE handled the electrical side of things. What about Python?
Python excels at data processing and analysis, so they used it to manage the input data for the networks, feed that data into the LT-SPICE simulations, and then analyze the output results.
So they had the devices, the mathematical models, the optimized parameters, and then this powerful combination of LT-SPICE and Python to actually run the simulations and see what happened. But was everything smooth sailing, or did they run into any roadblocks?
It wasn't all perfect, of course. They did hit some snags along the way. For example, in one of their case studies, they saw a pretty high mean squared error, or MSE.
So that means there was a noticeable difference between what their network predicted and the actual values from the water quality data set.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that even with all this advanced technology, getting accurate and reliable results isn't guaranteed. There are always factors that can affect the performance of these networks.
That makes sense. We're dealing with cutting-edge technology, and there's still a lot we're learning about memristors' behavior.
That's right. Memristor research is still in its early stages, and our understanding of their behavior is constantly evolving.
It's like we're at the beginning of an exciting journey. We've covered a ton of ground just in this first part of our deep dive, from the basic idea of a memristor to the complexities of modeling and simulation. We'll pick back up in part 2, where we'll take a closer look at what they actually found in the thesis and explore what it all means for the future of artificial intelligence.
So diving further into this thesis, it really hits you just how complex this whole area of Memristor research is. I mean, even with all the advanced models and fabrication techniques they used, there are still so many challenges when it comes to actually harnessing the full potential of these tiny devices.
Yeah, it seems like they're really pushing the boundaries of what we know about memristors. You mentioned in the last part that one of the challenges they encountered was getting accurate simulation results. What kind of factors could be contributing to those discrepancies between the models and the actual behavior they observed in their memristor networks?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that even the most sophisticated models we have right now might not be able to capture every little detail of how memristors actually behave.
Hmm.
Remember, we're talking about things at the nanoscale here, where tiny variations in the materials or even the dimensions can have a huge impact.
Right, so it's like those super sensitive systems where even a tiny change can cascade and lead to big differences in the outcome.
Exactly. And on top of that, we're still in the early stages of figuring out exactly how memristors behave under different conditions. The thesis really highlights this, emphasizing just how important ongoing research is if we want to improve both our models and our fabrication techniques.
It makes sense. Scientific progress isn't always a straight line. We build models, test them, refine them, test again. It's a constant back and forth.
Right. And this thesis is a perfect example of that. They went to great lengths to not only create those sophisticated models, but also to really carefully characterize the memristors they actually fabricated,
Yeah.
using that data to make their models even better.
Speaking of models, I want to circle back to the two types of memristor-based neural networks they explored in their simulations,
Yeah.
single output layer and the multi-output layer networks. You explained the basic idea earlier, but I'm wondering if you can dive a bit deeper into the specific applications they looked at for each type.
Sure. So for the single output networks, they were really focused on showing that these networks can handle basic logical operations, kind of like the building blocks you find in traditional computers.
So essentially, they were demonstrating that memristor networks could be used to create those fundamental logic gate, A and D, or not, that form the basis of how computers work.
Yep. It was sort of a proof of concept showing that you can use these new building blocks, these memristors, to create the foundation for a whole new type of computing system.
It's like demonstrating that you can make the basic ingredients you need to cook up something entirely new. And what about the multi-output networks? You mentioned they used that water quality data set for their experiments. What kind of insights did they gain from that particular application?
That was a really interesting application. They used the water quality dataset as a real-world test case to see how memristor neural networks could be used for things like complex data analysis and prediction. By training their network on this dataset, they were able to show that it could actually learn some of the relationships between the characteristics of the water and whether or not certain organisms were present in those Slovenian rivers.
That's amazing. It really opens up the possibility of using these networks for environmental monitoring and prediction, which has huge implications for conservation efforts.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show how versatile these networks can be. They're not limited to just replicating the tasks we do with traditional computers. They can be used to analyze complex data from the natural world. And who knows what kind of new insights and discoveries that might lead to.
It's like we're starting to get a glimpse of how these networks could not only mimic the human brain, but also actually extend our ability to understand and interact with the world around us.
I like that. That's a really good way to put it. It's that potential that makes memristor research so fascinating. We're not just talking about building faster computers here. It's about exploring completely new ways of thinking about computation and intelligence.
Now, you mentioned before that they used LT-SPICE and Python to run those simulations. Can you walk me through how those tools work together to create that virtual environment for testing the memristor networks?
Sure, picture LT-SPICE as like a digital breadboard. It's a virtual space where you can connect different components, apply voltages and currents, and essentially see how your circuit behaves. In this case, they used LT-SPICE to create virtual models of their Memristor neural networks.
Okay, so LT-SPICE provided the platform for simulating how the electrical signals would flow through the networks. What about Python? Where does that come in?
Well, Python's a great language for all kinds of data stuff, like manipulating, analyzing, visualizing data. They used it to prepare the input data for their networks, get it all set up to feed into those LT-SPICE simulations, and then to make sense of the results that came out.
So Python acted as the bridge between the real-world data they were using and the virtual environment they had set up in LT-SPICE.
Exactly. It helped manage the flow of data and pull out meaningful insights from those simulations.
It sounds like they really had to put together a pretty sophisticated workflow, combining all these specialized software tools to build, simulate, and analyze these complex networks.
Yeah, they did. And it really highlights how interdisciplinary this type of research is. It's not just physics or material science. It pulls in computer science, data analysis, even elements of biology and neuroscience.
It's a great example of how truly groundbreaking scientific progress often happens at the intersection of different fields.
Absolutely. And the thesis we're discussing here is a perfect example of that. It's a really cool blend of cutting-edge physics, innovative engineering, and sophisticated computational modeling.
We've gotten through a lot in this second part of our deep dive. We look closer at the challenges of modeling and simulating these Memristor networks, talked about the specific applications they investigated, and now have a better understanding of all the tools and techniques they used. But there's still more to unravel. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll step back and look at the bigger implications of this research and what it might mean for the future of artificial intelligence and computing as a whole. Okay, so we've spent the past two parts digging deep, really deep, into the technical nitty-gritty of memristors and how they could completely change the game for neural networks. Now I'm curious, what does all this mean in the bigger picture? What are the implications of this research out in the real world? How could memristor-based neural networks actually impact our lives, in the not-so-distant future?
That's a great question, and it's something the thesis does touch on a little bit, although the main focus is definitely on the scientific and engineering aspects. But one of the most exciting areas where this could have a major impact is, of course, artificial intelligence.
AI, yeah. We've been talking about how memristors could lead to neural networks that are way more efficient, adaptable, and structurally similar to the human brain. So what could that actually look like in terms of concrete advancements in things like machine learning, pattern recognition, maybe even robotics?
Well, just imagine AI assistants that can actually understand and respond to natural language, not just follow pre-programmed commands, or picture self-driving cars that can handle complex situations, making decisions with the same kind of intuition and judgment as a human driver.
Okay, those are some pretty mind-blowing possibilities. But like with any new technology, especially one this powerful, there are bound to be potential downsides too. Are there any concerns or challenges that we should be thinking about as this technology continues to develop?
Definitely. One big challenge is scalability. The thesis shows how promising memristors are in a controlled lab environment, but actually scaling up production to create the billions, maybe even trillions of memristors you'd need for really complex AI systems, well, that's a huge engineering feat.
Right, it's like the difference between building a model airplane and building a real working jet. The basic principles might be the same, but the scale and the complexity are on totally different levels.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are also questions about things like reliability and stability. Memristors are still relatively new. We need to make sure they can perform reliably over long periods of time and that they can withstand wear and tear, especially for applications where safety and accuracy are absolutely critical.
It sounds like there's still quite a bit of work to be done before we start seeing memristor-based neural networks everywhere. But the potential is clearly enormous. Where do you think we might see this technology having a real-world impact in the near future? Any specific areas come to mind?
One area that I think is particularly exciting is edge computing. That's all about bringing computation and data processing closer to where the data is actually being generated instead of relying on those huge centralized cloud servers. And because memristors use so little power and they're so compact, they could be perfect for building powerful AI systems that can operate on things like smartphones or even tiny sensors embedded out in the environment.
So instead of all the AI smarts being concentrated in these massive data centers, we could have that processing power distributed throughout the world. That opens up some crazy possibilities for things like real-time environmental monitoring, personalized healthcare, even smarter infrastructure. The possibilities are really endless.
Absolutely. And, beyond those practical applications, there's also this deeper question about what it means to create machines that can learn and adapt in ways that mirror the human brain. It's really pushing us to rethink the boundaries between artificial and biological intelligence.
It's definitely a philosophical question as much as it is a technological one. As we continue to explore the potential of memristors and all these emerging technologies, we're going to have to grapple with these questions head on and make sure that these advancements ultimately benefit all of humanity.
I totally agree. The master's thesis we've been discussing gives us this incredible glimpse into a future where the line between the digital and the biological could get blurry. It's a future that's full of both incredible possibilities and some really profound questions that we need to address with wisdom and foresight.
Well, this has been a wild ride. We've journeyed from the microscopic world of memristors all the way to the vast landscape of artificial intelligence. We've explored the technical hurdles, the philosophical dilemmas, and everything in between. It's clear that this field is still in its early stages, but the potential is absolutely mind-blowing. It really makes you wonder what the future holds.
It's a testament to human ingenuity, that's for sure, and our constant drive to understand the universe and our place in it.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.